Marcus Thompson stepped off the tour bus at Buckingham Palace, with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him respect. At 52 years old, he had built a successful tech company in Silicon Valley, and was used to people jumping when he spoke. His expensive Italian leather shoes clicked against the London pavement as he adjusted his designer watch, a habit he had developed whenever he wanted to remind others of his wealth. The summer of 2019 had brought Marcus to London for what he called a victory tour. His company had just gone public, making him worth over $200 million overnight. He had booked the most expensive hotel suite in the city, hired a private driver, and planned to experience London like the royalty he believed he had become. His wife Sarah had chosen to stay home in California, tired of his increasingly arrogant behavior since their financial success. Standing before the iconic gates of Buckingham Palace, Marcus felt a familiar surge of superiority. He had read about the Queen's Guard online during his flight and found their traditions amusing. In his mind, these were just employees in costumes, no different from the workers at his tech company who scrambled to please him. The red tunics and tall black bearskin hats struck him as theatrical rather than dignified. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as tourists gathered around the famous sentries. Marcus watched as children posed for photos near the guards, their parents reminding them to keep their distance. He noticed how the guards remained perfectly still, their faces expressionless beneath their distinctive headwear. To Marcus, this stillness looked like weakness rather than discipline. Ridiculous, he muttered to himself, pulling out his gold-plated smartphone to record what he planned to be an entertaining video for his social media followers. He had over 50,000 followers who loved watching his displays of wealth and power. This would be perfect content, he thought, showing these British soldiers who was really in charge. Marcus approached one of the guards stationed near the main entrance. The young man stood at attention, his rifle held precisely at his side, his eyes focused straight ahead. The guard's uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. But Marcus saw only an employee who needed to acknowledge his importance. The other tourists began to take notice as Marcus positioned himself directly in front of the guard. He straightened his $5,000 suit jacket and cleared his throat loudly, expecting immediate attention. When the guard remained motionless, Marcus felt his familiar irritation rising. Throughout his business career, he had never tolerated being ignored. "I'm talking to you," Marcus said, his voice carrying the tone he used with subordinates. "I'm Marcus Thompson, CEO of Thompson Technologies. You might have heard of us. We're worth billions." He paused, waiting for recognition that never came. The guard's face remained a mask of professional indifference. Marcus's frustration grew as he realized his usual intimidation tactics were failing. At his company, mentioning his net worth was enough to make employees rush to accommodate his every whim. Here, standing before this silent figure in red, his wealth seemed meaningless. The realization both confused and angered him. Other tourists had begun to gather, some recording with their phones, others simply watching with curiosity. Marcus became aware of the audience and felt pressure to assert his dominance. He had built his reputation on never backing down from a confrontation, especially not in front of witnesses who might post videos online. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus demanded, stepping closer to the guard. "I employ over 3,000 people. I have contracts with governments around the world. I deserve your respect." His voice had risen to a level that drew disapproving looks from nearby families. But Marcus was beyond caring about social etiquette. The guard remained unmoved, his breathing steady, his posture perfect. Marcus had never encountered such complete indifference to his status. In boardrooms across America, his presence commanded immediate attention. CEOs and politicians sought his approval. Yet here stood a young man in a costume who acted as if Marcus was invisible. "I'm giving you an order," Marcus announced, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "I want you to salute me."
"Right now."
"I'm an important American businessman and I demand the respect I've earned." He crossed his arms and waited, certain that his forceful approach would finally break through the guard's professional facade. The crowd around them had grown larger, with tourists from various countries watching the spectacle unfold. Some looked embarrassed for Marcus. Others seemed entertained by the confrontation. A few British tourists shook their heads in disapproval, recognizing the ugly American stereotype playing out before their eyes. Marcus felt the weight of the stares, but interpreted them as anticipation rather than judgment. He believed the crowd was waiting to see him put this British soldier in his place. The thought energized him, reminding him of the rush he felt when closing difficult business deals or firing employees who challenged his authority. "I'm waiting," Marcus said, tapping his expensive watch. "I don't have all day. I have meetings with very important people." This was a lie, as his entire London itinerary consisted of tourist activities. But Marcus had learned that claiming busy schedules often impressed others and made them hurry to accommodate him. The guard's silence stretched on, creating a tension that Marcus misread as submission. He smiled smugly, convinced that he had won another battle of wills. In his experience, everyone eventually bent to his demands when faced with enough pressure. He had no reason to believe this situation would be any different. As Marcus prepared to enjoy his victory over what he saw as a stubborn employee, he remained completely unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. The Queen's Guard were not ordinary soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. They were elite warriors with years of training and a code of honor that had been forged through centuries of tradition. Marcus was about to learn that some things in this world could not be bought, intimidated, or commanded by wealth alone. 24-year-old James Harrison stood motionless in his scarlet tunic, but beneath his composed exterior lay the heart of a warrior forged through years of rigorous training and real combat experience. The young man who Marcus Thompson was attempting to command had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Coldstream Guards, one of the oldest regiments in the British Army. His calm demeanor was not weakness, but the controlled strength of a professional soldier who had faced life and death, situations that would have broken lesser men. James had joined the British Army at 18, driven by a family tradition of military service that stretched back 4 generations. His great-grandfather had fought in World War II, his grandfather in Korea, and his father had served in the Falklands War. The Harrison family understood duty, honor, and sacrifice in ways that Marcus Thompson's privileged upbringing had never required him to learn. The path to becoming a Queen's Guard was not simply a matter of putting on a uniform and standing still. James had endured months of brutal training that pushed him to his physical and mental limits. He had learned to march for hours in the scorching heat while wearing the heavy woolen uniform and 18-inch bearskin hat that weighed over a pound. He had mastered the art of remaining perfectly still for hours, even when tourists tried to make him laugh, when children tugged at his uniform, or when inconsiderate visitors took inappropriate photos. During his time in Afghanistan, James had served as a machine gunner in some of the most dangerous regions of Helmand Province. He had protected his fellow soldiers during firefights with Taliban insurgents, had seen friends wounded and killed, and had learned the true meaning of courage under fire. The young man who now stood before Marcus had pulled wounded comrades to safety while under enemy fire, had made split-second decisions that saved lives, and had earned commendations for bravery that Marcus could never understand. The transition from active combat to ceremonial duties might seem like a step down to civilians, but James understood the deep honor of his current role. Guarding the sovereign was a privilege reserved for only the most elite soldiers. Every Queen's Guard was a combat veteran who had proven himself worthy of protecting the crown. They were not tourist attractions, but active military personnel carrying loaded rifles and authorized to use lethal force if necessary. James had been briefed extensively on how to handle difficult tourists. The training covered everything from dealing with drunk football fans to managing protesters who tried to breach security. He had learned to maintain his composure regardless of provocation, understanding that his behavior reflected not only on himself, but on the entire British military and the monarchy itself. Every moment of his duty was a test of his professionalism and self-control. As Marcus continued his demands, James's mind automatically assessed the threat level. His training had taught him to read body language, to identify potential security risks, and to remain alert even while appearing completely still. He noted Marcus's aggressive posture, his raised voice, and his increasingly erratic behavior. While Marcus posed no physical danger, James recognized the man as a problematic individual who might escalate the situation if not handled properly. The young guard had encountered many similar individuals during his ceremonial duties. Wealthy tourists who believed money gave them the right to command respect. politicians who tried to use their positions for special treatment, and celebrities who expected special recognition. James had learned that the best response was often complete professionalism, allowing such people to expose their own character flaws while maintaining the dignity of his position. Behind his impassive expression, James felt a mixture of pity and disgust for the American businessman. He had served alongside soldiers who had sacrificed everything for their countries, who had died protecting others, who had shown true nobility in the face of overwhelming odds. Marcus Thompson represented everything James had learned to despise during his military service: entitlement without sacrifice, arrogance without achievement, and demands for respect without any understanding of how respect was truly earned. James's military training had taught him that true strength came from service to others, not from accumulating wealth or demanding subservience. He had learned leadership from officers who led by example, who shared the dangers and hardships of their men, who earned loyalty through their actions rather than their bank accounts. The contrast between Marcus's pathetic display and the genuine leaders James had known could not have been starker. The crowd gathering around them included several British military veterans who recognized the situation for what it was. James could sense their silent support, their shared understanding of military protocol and tradition. These men and women understood that the Queen's Guard represented something larger than themselves, something that could not be bought or bullied into submission. As Marcus's voice grew louder and more demanding, James remained perfectly centered in his training. He had learned meditation techniques that allowed him to disconnect from external distractions while remaining fully alert to genuine threats. His breathing stayed controlled, his heartbeat steady, his mind clear. This was not his first encounter with an entitled tourist, and it would not be his last. James thought briefly of his fellow soldiers who had not returned from Afghanistan, young men and women who had given their lives in service to their country. Their sacrifice had taught him the true meaning of honor, a concept that seemed completely foreign to the man now shouting at him. Marcus's behavior was not just disrespectful to James personally, but to every soldier who had ever worn the uniform, every person who had ever served something greater than themselves. The weight of tradition rested on James's shoulders, literally and figuratively. The uniform he wore had been worn by generations of guardsmen who had protected monarchs through wars, revolutions, and national crises. Each thread represented a connection to history, to duty, to sacrifice that transcended any individual ego or personal agenda. Marcus Thompson might have millions of dollars, but he would never understand the wealth of honor that came from true service. As the confrontation continued, James prepared himself for what he knew must come next. His training and experience had taught him that bullies like Marcus eventually overstepped boundaries when their initial tactics failed. The question was not whether Marcus would push too far, but when. James was ready. Marcus Thompson's patience had completely evaporated as he stood before the silent guard. His face had turned red with frustration, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool London morning. The man who was accustomed to immediate compliance from everyone around him could not comprehend why his usual tactics were failing so spectacularly. His expensive education and business success had never prepared him for an encounter with someone who simply refused to acknowledge his perceived superiority. "Listen to me, you little toy soldier," Marcus snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. "I've built an empire from nothing. I employ thousands of people who depend on me for their livelihoods. I pay more in taxes each year than you'll make in your entire pathetic career. The least you can do is show me some basic respect." His words carried across the courtyard, causing several tour groups to stop and stare at the unfolding drama. The businessman reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick leather wallet, the kind that wealthy men used to display their status. He opened it dramatically, revealing a stack of crisp 100-pound notes that he waved in front of the guard's face. "You see this? This is real money, more than you've probably ever seen at once. I could change your life with what I carry in my pocket. All I'm asking for is a simple salute. That's it. One salute and I'll make it worth your while." Marcus was so focused on his attempted bribery that he failed to notice the crowd's reaction to his behavior. British tourists shook their heads in disgust, while visitors from other countries seemed embarrassed to witness such a display of American arrogance. Parents pulled their children away from the scene, not wanting them to witness such inappropriate behavior. The atmosphere had shifted from curious entertainment to uncomfortable tension. Come on, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a wheedling tone as he mistook the guard's silence for consideration of his offer. I know you military types don't make much money. Here's your chance to earn more in 5 minutes than you probably make in a month. Just one little salute. Nobody has to know you did it for the money. We can both walk away happy. James Harrison's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but the blatant attempt at corruption still shocked him. In his years of military service, he had seen the devastating effects of corruption on military units and entire nations. He had fought alongside Afghan soldiers whose units had been compromised by officers who accepted bribes, leading to ambushes and unnecessary deaths. The very suggestion that he might compromise his integrity for money was deeply offensive to everything he stood for. Marcus interpreted the guard's continued silence as stubborn resistance rather than professional discipline. His business instincts told him that everyone had a price, and he simply needed to find the right amount to break through this soldier's resolve. He pulled out more money, making sure the growing crowd could see the impressive display of cash. Okay, you're a tough negotiator, Marcus said with a laugh that sounded forced and unnatural. I respect that. How about this? He peeled off several more notes, holding them out toward the guard. 500 pounds. That's probably more than you make in 2 weeks, all for 30 seconds of work. Just raise your hand to your forehead and we're done. The offer drew gasps from several onlookers who could not believe they were witnessing an attempted bribery of a Queen's Guard in broad daylight. Some began recording with their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become viral on social media. Others looked around for police officers, wondering if what they were seeing was actually illegal. Marcus was so absorbed in his negotiation that he completely missed the subtle signs of James's growing anger. The guard's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, his breathing had become slightly more controlled, and his grip on his rifle had shifted in a way that only another soldier would recognize. James was not considering the bribe. He was exercising enormous self-control to avoid responding in a way that would compromise his position. You know what? Marcus said, his tone becoming more aggressive as his patience finally snapped completely. I'm tired of playing games with you. I'm an American citizen, and I demand to speak to your superior officer. I want to file a complaint about your attitude. This is customer service at its worst, and I won't tolerate it. The businessman stepped even closer to the guard, invading his personal space in a way that would have triggered a physical response from most people. I'm going to make sure you get fired for this. I have connections in high places, people who can make phone calls that will end your little career. You think you're so tough standing there in your fancy costume, but you're nothing. You're a nobody who will be forgotten while I continue to build my legacy. Marcus was so caught up in his tirade that he failed to notice several important developments around him. Palace security personnel had begun moving closer to his position, alerted by the commotion and the reports from other guards who had been monitoring the situation. Tourist police officers were also approaching, having been summoned by concerned visitors who recognized that the situation was escalating beyond normal tourist behavior. I'm going to count to 10, Marcus announced, as if he were disciplining a child rather than addressing a trained soldier. If you don't give me the salute I deserve by the time I reach 10, I'm going to make sure you regret it for the rest of your life. I have lawyers who specialize in destroying people like you. I have investigators who can dig up dirt on anyone. I have the resources to make your life a living hell. The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the atmosphere around the palace gates. Marcus had crossed multiple lines of acceptable behavior, moving from mere rudeness to attempted bribery to outright intimidation. He had revealed the ugly truth about his character, showing everyone present exactly what kind of man he really was beneath the expensive clothes and practiced charm. James Harrison had reached the limit of his tolerance, though his expression remained unchanged. In his mind, he was no longer dealing with just a rude tourist, but with someone who represented a threat to the dignity and integrity of his unit. The guard's response, when it came, would not be the reaction of an entertainer trying to please a customer, but the measured response of a professional soldier defending his honor and the honor of his regiment. Marcus Thompson had reached his final count, his voice echoing off the palace walls as he shouted 10 at the motionless guard. The businessman's face was now purple with rage, and his expensive suit was wrinkled from his aggressive gesturing. Spittle flew from his mouth as he screamed his ultimatum. completely unaware that he had just crossed the final line that would trigger the guard's official response protocols. "That's it," Marcus roared, his voice cracking with fury. "I've had enough of your disrespect. You want to play games? Fine, I'm going to destroy you." In his blind rage, Marcus made the catastrophic decision that would change everything. He reached out with his right hand and placed it firmly on James Harrison's chest, pushing against the guard's uniform in an attempt to provoke a reaction. The physical contact was like flipping a switch in James's military training. What had been a situation requiring patience and professional restraint had instantly become a security incident involving assault on a Queen's Guard. The moment Marcus's hand touched his uniform, James was no longer bound by the protocols governing tourist interactions. He was now operating under combat rules of engagement. James Harrison's response was swift, precise, and devastating in its controlled fury. His voice, when it finally came, carried the authority of centuries of military tradition and the power of a soldier who had earned his position through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The sound that emerged from his throat was not the polite response of a service worker, but the commanding bark of a combat veteran who had faced down armed insurgents in Afghanistan. "Get back!" James roared, his voice exploding across the courtyard with such force that nearby tourists jumped backward in shock. The sound was not human conversation, but a weapon of trained intimidation, designed to stop enemies in their tracks. Marcus stumbled backward, his face suddenly pale as he realized he had awakened something far more dangerous than he had imagined. But James was far from finished. His voice continued to thunder across the palace grounds, each word delivered with military precision and devastating effect. "You do not touch a Queen's Guard. You do not approach a Queen's Guard. You do not command a Queen's Guard." Each statement was punctuated by a pause that seemed to echo with the weight of military law and royal protocol. The transformation in James Harrison was complete and terrifying. The silent, motionless figure had become a force of nature, his voice carrying the accumulated authority of every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. His posture remained perfect, his rifle still held at the precise angle required by regulations. But his voice had become a weapon more powerful than any gun. "I am not your employee," James continued, his voice carrying across the entire palace courtyard and drawing the attention of guards at every post. "I am not your servant. I am a soldier of the British Army, a guardian of the crown and a veteran of Her Majesty's wars. You will show respect or you will be removed." Marcus stood frozen in shock, his mouth hanging open as he tried to process what was happening. The man who had spent his entire adult life intimidating others suddenly found himself face to face with someone who could not be intimidated, could not be bought, and would not be disrespected. For the first time in decades, Marcus Thompson was genuinely afraid. The crowd around them had grown silent, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Children pressed closer to their parents. Tourists lowered their cameras, and even the most jaded London residents stopped to listen to the guard's powerful words. The atmosphere had become electric with tension and respect for the authority being displayed. "You want to know who I am?" James's voice continued to boom across the courtyard. "I am Guardsman James Harrison of the Coldstream Guards. I have served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I have protected this nation with my blood, my sweat, and my life. I have earned the right to wear this uniform through sacrifice you could never understand." The personal revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. This was not some ceremonial performer, but a real warrior, a man who had seen combat, who had risked everything in service to his country. Marcus's attempts at intimidation suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate when faced with someone who had survived actual warfare. "You think your money impresses me?" James continued, his voice carrying a contempt so deep it seemed to chill the air around them. "I have served alongside men who died for their country. I have held the hands of heroes as they breathed their last breath. Your paper money is worthless compared to the blood of patriots." Marcus felt his knees beginning to shake as the full weight of his mistake became clear. He had not been confronting an employee or a performer, but a genuine hero, a man who had earned his position through genuine courage and sacrifice. The businessman's wealth and status seemed insignificant in the face of such real accomplishment and honor. The guard's response was far from over. James had years of suppressed frustration with entitled tourists, and Marcus had provided the perfect opportunity to release it all in one devastating verbal assault. His voice carried the pain of lost comrades, the pride of military service, and the fury of a professional soldier whose honor had been questioned by someone unworthy to shine his boots. Palace security and tourist police were now running toward the scene, but they slowed their approach as they recognized that the situation was being handled perfectly by the guard himself. They had never seen such a magnificent display of military bearing and controlled anger. James Harrison was providing a masterclass in how to destroy an opponent with words alone. Marcus Thompson, the man who had believed himself capable of commanding a Queen's Guard, now stood before that same guard completely broken and humiliated. His expensive clothes, his designer accessories, his confident demeanor had all been stripped away by the raw power of James Harrison's response. The businessman finally understood that he had not been dealing with a servant, but with a warrior, and warriors were not for sale. The silence that followed James Harrison's thunderous verbal assault was deafening. Marcus Thompson stood frozen in place, his face drained of all color, his expensive suit now appearing ridiculous rather than impressive. The businessman who had entered the palace grounds with supreme confidence now looked like a deflated balloon, all his arrogance punctured by the guard's devastating response. Palace security officers reached the scene within moments, their approach professional and measured. They had witnessed the entire confrontation and understood immediately that Marcus was the aggressor in the situation. The lead officer, Sergeant Patricia Wells, had 20 years of experience dealing with difficult tourists, but she had rarely seen someone humiliate themselves so thoroughly in such a public setting. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the guard and come with me," Sergeant Wells said to Marcus, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing crises. Her tone was polite but firm, making it clear that compliance was not optional. Marcus looked around desperately, as if seeking an escape route or someone who might support his position. The crowd of tourists had swelled to over 100 people, many of whom had their phones out recording the encounter. Marcus suddenly realized that his humiliation was being broadcast live to the internet, where it would likely be viewed by millions of people around the world. The thought of his business associates, competitors, and employees seeing him reduced to such a pathetic state filled him with a new kind of terror. I was just... Marcus began, his voice now weak and trembling, a stark contrast to the commanding tone he had used just minutes earlier. The businessman who had threatened to destroy the guard's career now seemed incapable of forming a complete sentence. His hands shook as he tried to put his money back into his wallet. The bills scattered and crumpled from his frantic gesturing. James Harrison had returned to his position of attention, his face once again impassive, his posture perfect. The transformation back to ceremonial stillness was as impressive as his verbal explosion had been. He showed no signs of the emotional intensity he had just displayed, giving no indication that anything unusual had occurred. His professionalism was absolute, his control complete. Sergeant Wells guided Marcus away from the guard post, her grip on his arm gentle but unyielding. As they walked toward the security office, Marcus could hear the murmurs of the crowd behind him. Comments in multiple languages followed their progress, none of them complimentary to the disgraced businessman. He caught fragments of conversations in English that made his humiliation burn even deeper. "Did you see how that guard put him in his place?" One British woman was saying to her companion. "Absolutely brilliant. That's what happens when you try to disrespect our military." Her words were echoed by nods and agreements from other onlookers who had witnessed the confrontation from the beginning. Inside the security office, Marcus found himself facing a formal interview about his behavior. Sergeant Wells was joined by Inspector David McKinnon, a veteran police officer who specialized in handling incidents at royal residences. The inspector's manner was professional but stern as he reviewed the video footage that had been captured by the palace's extensive security camera system. "Mr. Thompson," Inspector McKinnon began, his Scottish accent adding gravity to his words, "I need to inform you that your actions today constitute several violations of British law. You attempted to bribe a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. You made threatening statements toward a military personnel, and you physically assaulted a Queen's Guard by making unwanted contact with his person." The legal implications began to sink into Marcus's consciousness, cutting through the fog of humiliation and shock. He had come to London as a wealthy tourist seeking entertainment, and was now facing potential criminal charges that could result in imprisonment and international scandal. His business empire, built over decades of ruthless ambition, could be destroyed by a few minutes of poor judgment. The good news for you, the inspector continued, is that Guardsman Harrison has declined to press formal charges. He feels that your public humiliation was sufficient punishment for your behavior. However, you are being issued a formal warning, and any future incidents of this nature will result in immediate arrest and prosecution to the full extent of the law. Marcus felt a wave of relief mixed with continued shame. The guard he had tried to humiliate and threaten had shown him mercy he did not deserve. James Harrison had demonstrated not only courage and integrity, but also compassion in his decision not to pursue legal action. The contrast between the guard's nobility and Marcus's own behavior was stark and painful to contemplate. Outside the security office, the crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown larger as word of the incident spread through social media. Videos of James Harrison's verbal destruction of Marcus were already going viral, with hashtags like "Respect the Guard" and "Don't Mess with British Soldiers" trending across multiple platforms. The footage was being shared thousands of times per hour, turning the incident into a global phenomenon. News reporters had begun arriving at the palace. Drawn by the viral nature of the videos and the human interest angle of the story, local television stations were preparing segments about the incident, while international news organizations were picking up the story as an example of American tourist behavior abroad. Marcus's humiliation was becoming a worldwide spectacle. When Marcus was finally released from the security office, he emerged to find a gauntlet of cameras and reporters waiting for him. Questions were shouted from multiple directions as he attempted to make his way to his waiting car. "Mr. Thompson, do you regret your behavior? What do you have to say to the guard you insulted? How do you respond to criticism of your conduct?" Marcus pushed through the crowd without responding, his head down, his confidence completely shattered. The man who had arrived at Buckingham Palace believing himself entitled to command respect from anyone was leaving as a global symbol of arrogance humbled by genuine dignity. His expensive car, which had seemed like a symbol of success that morning, now felt like an escape pod from the wreckage of his reputation. As his driver pulled away from the palace, Marcus caught one final glimpse of James Harrison in his rearview mirror. The guard stood at his post perfectly still, perfectly professional, completely unaffected by the chaos he had created with his words. The image would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life, a reminder of what real strength and character looked like when confronted with weakness and entitlement. Within hours of the confrontation at Buckingham Palace, the video of James Harrison's verbal destruction of Marcus Thompson had become the most watched content on social media platforms around the world. The footage, captured from multiple angles by tourists with smartphones, showed every moment of Marcus's humiliation in crystal clear detail. The audio quality was perfect, ensuring that James's powerful words reached millions of viewers with their full impact. The story exploded across news networks on every continent. BBC News led with the headline, "American Businessman Humiliated by Queen's Guard After Attempted Bribery." CNN ran the story under "Viral Video Shows British Soldiers Epic Response to Entitled Tourist." Even Al Jazeera and other international outlets picked up the story, framing it as an example of military professionalism triumphing over civilian arrogance. On Twitter, the hashtag #Tockern'sGuardsman's reply had been shared over 2 million times within the first 6 hours. Users from around the world were praising James Harrison's response while condemning Marcus Thompson's behavior. Military veterans from dozens of countries shared their own stories of dealing with entitled civilians who failed to understand the sacrifice and dedication required for military service. The British public's response was overwhelmingly positive toward James and harshly critical of Marcus. Royal family fan groups organized online campaigns to send letters of support to the Coldstream Guards. Military charities reported an immediate spike in donations as people sought to show their appreciation for the armed forces. James Harrison had become an overnight hero without ever seeking such recognition. In Silicon Valley, Marcus Thompson's business empire began to crumble almost immediately. The video had been shared extensively among tech industry professionals, many of whom were horrified by their colleagues' behavior. Thompson Technologies' stock price plummeted as investors worried about the reputational damage to the company. Several major clients began reviewing their contracts, concerned about being associated with Marcus's brand. Marcus's employees watched the video with a mixture of embarrassment and recognition. Many of them had experienced his bullying behavior firsthand, and were not surprised to see him act the same way toward a stranger. The Human Resources Department was flooded with complaints from workers who felt emboldened to speak out about Marcus's toxic management style now that his true character had been exposed to the world. The viral nature of the incident reached far beyond business circles. Universities began using the video in courses about leadership, ethics, and cross-cultural communication as an example of how not to behave. Military academies incorporated the footage into training programs about maintaining dignity under pressure. The incident became a case study in multiple disciplines. Social media influencers and content creators generated thousands of reaction videos, each adding their own commentary to James Harrison's performance. Many focused on the guard's perfect military bearing and the power of his verbal response. Military historians provided context about the traditions and training that had prepared James for exactly this type of situation. International media coverage varied by country but was universally critical of Marcus's behavior. British outlets celebrated James as a perfect example of their military's professionalism and training. American media was split between those who condemned Marcus as an embarrassment to their country and those who defended him as a victim of British arrogance. However, the overwhelming global consensus supported the guard's response. The incident sparked broader conversations about privilege, respect, and the treatment of military personnel. Op-ed writers and major newspapers used the story to discuss everything from income inequality to the value of military service in modern society. The confrontation had touched a nerve with people who felt that wealth and status had become more important than character and service. Marcus Thompson's personal life began to unravel as quickly as his business empire. His wife Sarah, who had stayed in California, was bombarded with interview requests from journalists seeking her perspective on her husband's behavior. Friends and neighbors who had once admired their wealth now viewed them with suspicion and embarrassment. The exclusive country club where Marcus had been a prominent member quietly suggested he consider resigning his membership. The psychological impact on Marcus was devastating. The man who had built his identity around commanding respect and fear from others now found himself the subject of global ridicule. He could not leave his hotel room without being recognized and confronted by strangers who had seen the video. His attempts to spin the story in his favor only made things worse, as every interview seemed to reveal more of his arrogant character. Meanwhile, James Harrison continued his duties with the same professionalism he had always shown. The Coldstream Guards received hundreds of letters and emails praising his conduct, but James refused all interview requests and public appearances. His commanding officers were proud of his performance but emphasized that he had simply done what any properly trained guard would have done in the same situation. The military community rallied around James, with veterans from around the world sharing their own experiences with difficult civilians. Social media was flooded with stories of military personnel who had faced similar disrespect but had maintained their composure and dignity. James had become a symbol of everything that was right about military service and training. Corporate executives began using the incident as a teaching tool in leadership seminars, pointing to Marcus as an example of how toxic leadership styles eventually lead to downfall. Business schools incorporated the case into their curricula as a lesson about the importance of humility and respect in professional relationships. The video became required viewing in several MBA programs. The tourism industry in London saw an unexpected boost as people from around the world wanted to visit Buckingham Palace and see the Queen's Guard for themselves. Tour guides reported increased interest in the history and training of the guards, with many visitors expressing newfound respect for the military personnel who protected the royal family. The incident had inadvertently become a powerful recruitment tool for the British Armed Forces. Religious leaders from various faiths used the story in sermons about pride, humility, and the true nature of strength. The contrast between Marcus's worldly power and James's moral authority resonated with congregations who struggled with similar issues in their own lives. The guard's response was seen as an example of righteous anger in defense of honor and tradition. Academic researchers began studying the incident as an example of how social Media could instantly transform a local event into a global phenomenon. Communication scholars analyzed the power of James's verbal response and its effectiveness in completely neutralizing Marcus's attempted intimidation. The confrontation became a textbook example of how authentic authority could triumph over artificial power. As the weeks passed, the incident continued to generate new content and discussion. Documentary filmmakers began working on projects about military tradition and the clash between old values and new money. Publishers approached ghostwriters about potential books examining the broader cultural implications of the confrontation. The simple exchange between a businessman and a guard had become a defining moment of the digital age. The global impact of James Harrison's response to Marcus Thompson's arrogance had far exceeded anything either man could have imagined. What had begun as a tourist's attempt to assert dominance had become a worldwide lesson about respect, dignity, and the true nature of strength. The guard's words would continue to echo long after both men had returned to their normal lives, serving as a reminder that some things in this world could not be bought, bullied, or commanded by wealth alone. 6 months after the confrontation that had changed both their lives forever, Marcus Thompson and James Harrison were living in completely different worlds than they had known before that fateful morning at Buckingham Palace. The viral incident had set in motion a series of consequences that neither man could have predicted, reshaping their futures in ways both profound and permanent. Marcus Thompson's fall from grace had been swift and merciless. Thompson Technologies, the company he had spent 20 years building, had been sold to a competitor at a fraction of its former value. The board of directors had voted unanimously to remove him as CEO, citing his public behavior as incompatible with the company's values and reputation. His personal stake in the business, once worth hundreds of millions, had evaporated as investors fled and contracts were canceled. The divorce proceedings with his wife Sarah had been particularly brutal. She had filed papers within a week of returning to California, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional abuse. In interviews with divorce attorneys, Sarah revealed years of Marcus's controlling behavior, his verbal abuse of service workers, and his treatment of their own household staff. The video from London had simply been the final confirmation of what she had endured privately for years. Marcus now lived alone in a modest apartment in San Jose, a dramatic step down from the mansion he had once called home. His legal fees had consumed much of his remaining wealth, and his attempts to start a new business had been met with skepticism from potential investors who remembered his public humiliation. The tech industry, once eager to court his favor, now viewed him as toxic and unemployable. The psychological toll had been perhaps even more devastating than the financial losses. Marcus had been forced to confront the reality that his entire identity had been built on a foundation of arrogance and entitlement that crumbled the moment it encountered genuine strength. He had begun therapy, reluctantly at first, but gradually coming to understand how his pursuit of power and control had poisoned every relationship in his life. In his quieter moments, Marcus found himself returning again and again to the memory of James Harrison's voice echoing across the palace courtyard. The guard's words had stripped away every pretense and revealed Marcus for what he truly was, a weak man who had mistaken wealth for strength, aggression for leadership, and fear for respect. The revelation was painful but necessary for any hope of redemption. Meanwhile, James Harrison had returned to his duties with the Coldstream Guards, determined to maintain the same level of professionalism that had defined his military career. Despite the global attention his response had generated, he remained focused on his responsibilities as a Queen's Guard and continued to serve with the dignity and honor that had made him a viral sensation. The British Army had handled James's newfound fame with characteristic discretion. While they were proud of his conduct during the incident, they ensured that he was not exploited or overwhelmed by media attention. His commanding officers provided support and counseling to help him deal with the unexpected scrutiny, making sure that his military duties remained his primary focus. James had been quietly promoted to Lance Corporal, a recognition of both his exemplary service and his handling of the Marcus Thompson incident. The promotion came with increased responsibilities, including training younger guards in the protocols and traditions that had served him so well during his confrontation with the entitled tourist. He found satisfaction in passing on the lessons he had learned about maintaining dignity under pressure. The letters and messages of support had continued to pour in from around the world. James read many of them during his off-duty hours, particularly those from fellow veterans who shared their own stories of dealing with disrespectful civilians. The correspondence had given him a broader perspective on the impact of his actions and the responsibility that came with representing his regiment and his country. In his personal life, James had begun a relationship with Emma, a nurse who worked at a military hospital and understood the demands of his service. She had been attracted not by his viral fame, but by his character and dedication to duty. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and shared values, providing James with the stability and support that had helped him remain grounded despite his unexpected celebrity. The incident had also strengthened James's connection to his military heritage. He had received letters from his father and grandfather, both military veterans, expressing their pride in how he had upheld the family tradition of honorable service. The knowledge that he had lived up to their example meant more to him than any amount of public praise or recognition. As the months passed, both men found themselves changed by their brief encounter in ways they were still discovering. Marcus was slowly, painfully learning humility and working to rebuild his life on a foundation of genuine respect for others. The process was difficult and often humiliating, but it was his only path to redemption and peace. James continued his service with the same dedication he had always shown, but with a deeper understanding of the impact that military bearing and professionalism could have on the world beyond the palace gates. His response to Marcus Thompson had become a teaching moment for an entire generation, demonstrating that true strength came not from wealth or position, but from character and integrity. The story of their confrontation had become part of modern folklore, retold in countless forums and referenced in discussions about respect, dignity, and the proper treatment of those who serve. It served as a reminder that in a world often dominated by money and celebrity, there were still people and institutions that could not be bought, bullied, or corrupted. Years later, both men would occasionally think about that morning at Buckingham Palace and the few minutes that had changed everything. For Marcus, it remained a source of shame, but also the beginning of his journey toward becoming a better person. For James, it was simply another day of doing his duty, though one that had shown the world what that duty truly meant. The Queen's Guard continued to stand at their posts, protecting the crown and maintaining traditions that stretched back centuries. Tourists continued to visit and take photographs, most of them now showing considerably more respect than they might have before James Harrison's words had echoed around the world. And somewhere in London, a young soldier stood at attention, ready to defend the honor of his uniform and his country against anyone foolish enough to challenge either.